Hi, Year 9. I hope you're all well and you're all healthy and you are doing okay with working from home. I know it's really strange, but those that are sending me your work, you're doing really well, and I'm really impressed. I was having a bit of a debate with myself of how to progress and go forward, especially as we go further into the reading. If we were in the classroom together, we would be having discussions and I'd be able to zoom in on certain parts of the text. And obviously, we're not able to do that at the moment. So I thought for the lessons where there's quite a lot of reading, and where we would have some quite lengthy discussions, I might do a video to support it just so that I can point you in some directions and give you as much support as possible. It's taken me a long time to figure out how to even do this, so hopefully it works and hopefully it gets to you okay. Today's lesson, and this is going to count as 2 lessons, so I'll put it on Insight as 2 just because there's the reading section and then there's the actual writing section that I need you to do, and it will probably take you longer than the allocated time. So this will be a double lesson. So sorry, double me talking at you. But today and next lesson, we're focusing on the inspector and him being introduced to the audience. Where we got up to in reading, so you would have done your last bit of reading last Friday. Where we got up to was Mr. Burling just finishing his speech with Gerald, where he was saying that the Germans don't want war and the Titanic is unsinkable, and he was saying that he's going to get this apparent knighthood. Pretty much he was boasting to Gerald, trying to impress his future son-in-law. Until a stage direction said, we hear the sharp ring of a doorbell. Burling stops to listen. So a slight spoiler in the title of who might be at the door. It is worth pointing out before we start reading that in that stage direction it says we hear the sharp ring of the doorbell. So this stops Mr. Burling in his tracks. He has to stop speaking because of this sharp ring. We could say that that adjective sharp could suggest or foreshadow that maybe whoever's at the door isn't coming with good news, or maybe something bad is going to happen with this sharp sound at the door. What I'm going to do is move over to the text, and I'm going to read through the next section to you, with you, and I'm going to stop as we go and have a bit of it's not really a discussion because I'm sat here on my own, but talk through some bits in more detail as we would do in class. If you would rather read this independently, then just skip the reading, but I am going to zoom in on some certain parts, so it might be worthwhile. Okay. So this is where we got to. By the way, the whole text is online. If you just search Inspector Calls full text, the whole thing's there. This is where we got to. We hear the sharp ring of a doorbell. Burling stops to listen. Like I said, I'll read this to you. I can't really do voices. I tried. It was terrible. But follow it with me, and I'll tell you when we're moving on to a discussion. So, somebody at the front door. Edna will answer it. We'll have another glass of port, Gerald, and then we'll join the ladies. That'll stop me giving you good advice. Yes, you've piled it on a bit tonight, Father. A special occasion. I'm feeling contented for once. I wanted you to have the benefit of my experience. Edna enters. So Edna, as a reminder, is the maid. Please, sir, an inspector's called. An inspector? What kind of inspector? A police inspector. He says his name's Inspector Goole. Don't know him. Does he want to see me? Yes, sir. He says it's important. All right, Edna. Show him in here. Give us some more light. Edna does, then goes out. I'm still on the bench. It may be something about a warrant. Lightly. Sure to be, unless Eric's been up to something. Nodding confidently to Burling. And that would be awkward, wouldn't it? Humorously. Very. Who is uneasy, sharply. Here, what do you mean? Lightly. Only something we were talking about when you were out. A joke, really. Still uneasy. Well, I don't think it's very funny. Sharply, staring at him. What's the matter with you? Defiantly. Nothing. Opening door and announcing. Inspector Gould. The inspector enters and Edna goes, closing door after her. The inspector need not be a big man, but he creates at once an impression of massiveness, solidity, and purposefulness. He is a man in his 50s, dressed in a plain, darkish suit of the period. He speaks carefully, weightily, and has a disconcerting habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before actually speaking, which, as a side note, means he'll stare at someone and then speak, so it probably makes people feel quite uncomfortable when he's talking to them. Mr. Burling? Yes, sit down, Inspector. Sitting. Thank you, sir. Have a glass of port, or a little whisky? No, thank you, Mr. Burling. I'm on duty. You're new, aren't you? Yes, sir. Only recently transferred. I thought you must be. I was an alderman for years, and Lord Mayor 2 years ago, and I'm still on the bench, so I know the Brumley police officers pretty well, and I thought I'd never seen you before. Quite so. Well, what can I do for you? Some trouble about a warrant? No, Mr. Burling. After a pause with a touch of impatience. Well, what is it then? I'd like some information, if you don't mind, Mr. Burling. 2 hours ago, a young woman died on the infirmary. She'd been taken there this afternoon because she'd swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant. Burnt her inside out, of course. Involuntary. My God! Yes, she was in great agony. They did everything they could for her at the infirmary, but she died. Suicide, of course. Rather impatiently. Yes, horrid business. But I don't understand why you should come here, Inspector. Cutting through massively. I've been round to the room she had, and she'd left a letter and a sort of diary. Like a lot of these young women who get into various kinds of trouble, she'd use more than one name. But her original name, her real name, was Eva Smith. Thoughtfully. Eva Smith. Do you remember her, Mr. Burling? Slowly. No, I seem to remember hearing that name. Eva Smith. Somewhere. But it doesn't convey anything to me, and I don't see why I come into this. She was employed in your works at one time. Oh, that's it, is it? Well, we've several hundred young women there, you know, and they keep changing. This young woman, Eva Smith, was out of the ordinary. I found a photograph of her in her lodgings. Perhaps you'd remember her from that. Inspector takes a photograph about postcard size out of his pocket and goes to Burling. Both Gerald and Eric rise to have a look at the photograph, but the inspector interposes himself between them and the photograph. They are surprised and rather annoyed. Burling stares hard and with recognition at the photograph, which the inspector then places in his pocket. Showing annoyance. Any particular reason why I shouldn't see the girl's photograph, Inspector? Coolly, looking hard at him. There might be. And the same applies to me, I suppose. Yes. I can't imagine what it could be. Neither can I. And I must say I agree with them, Inspector. It's the way I like to work. One person and one line of inquiry at a time. Otherwise, there's a muddle. I see. Sensible, really. Moos restlessly, then turns. You've had enough of that port, Eric. The inspector is watching Burling, and now Burling notices him. I think you remember Eva Smith now, don't you, Mr. Burling? Yes, I do. She was one of my employees, and I discharged her, so he fired her. Is that why she committed suicide? When was this, Father? Oh, just keep quiet, Eric, and don't get excited. This girl left us nearly 2 years ago. me see. I must have been in the early autumn of 1910. Yes, end of September 1910. That's right. Look here, sir. Wouldn't you rather I was out of this? I don't mind you being here, Gerald, and I'm sure you've no objection, have you, Inspector? Perhaps I ought to explain first that Mr. Gerald Croft, the son of Sir Gerald Croft, you know, Croft Limited. Mr. Gerald Croft, eh? Yes. Incidentally, we've been modestly celebrating his engagement to my daughter Sheila. I see. Mr. Croft is going to marry Miss Sheila Burling. Smiling. I hope so. Gravely. Then I'd prefer you stay. So we're going to stop reading there. For when you do more reading in our next lesson, it's worth remembering that's the line that we got to. Inspector gravely, then I prefer you stay. So this is our first meeting with the inspector. We've already learnt loads about him, and we're going to go into some detail of what we've learnt about him now. So, the stage direction when the inspector first enters goes as follows. The inspector need not be a big man, but he creates at once an impression of massiveness, solidity, and purposefulness. He is a man in his 50s, dressed in a plain darky suit of the period. He speaks carefully, weightily, and has a disconcerting habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before actually speaking. So, J.B. Priestley has chosen the words massiveness, solidity, and purposefulness for our first impression of the inspector. So why has Priestley chosen these three words in particular? The first thing that I want you to do, and what I'll get you to do, is pause the video in a second and spend a couple of minutes on this task, drawing this Venn diagram. I hope it's called a Venn diagram. Drawing this Venn diagram. And what I want you to do is come up with the words that come to mind when you see the words massiveness, solidity, and purposefulness. When you first see the word massiveness, well, what comes to mind for you? So pause the video now, draw this Venn diagram, and come up with words that come to mind when you see the three words that Priestley has chosen to use to describe the inspector. Assuming you pause the video, I will carry on. But the reason I've got you to do this is because I want you to think, well, what impression does Priestley want us to get of the inspector straight away? If he has this massiveness about him, then obviously he might be quite important. The solidity might be that he is quite a strong person, that he is quite stable, and maybe he has quite strong opinions. And that purposefulness again shows that power, shows that he is there with reason, and maybe that he won't hold back. That would be some of the impressions we've got of the inspector from the start. But hopefully you've got lots of words in your Venn diagram. Okay, the next section we're going to look at is when the inspector is explaining what has happened to our new character, Eva Smith. So the inspector says, I'd like some information if you don't mind, Mr. Burling. 2 hours ago, a young woman died in the infirmary. She'd been taken there this afternoon because she swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant. Burnt her inside out, of course. And then Eric replies involuntary, my God. The inspector replies, yes, she was in great agony. They did everything they could for her at the infirmary, but she died. Suicide, of course. So this inspector has arrived and is sharing this really sad and upsetting news with the family. And if you've noticed, his way of words and the way of explaining this isn't very soft. He hasn't held back. He's using quite blunt language here, saying that she swallowed the strong disinfectant, burnt her inside out. So as a professional, as a police officer, that's quite harsh vocabulary to use, and we could say that this is some graphic imagery being used. So the inspector is using graphic imagery. What I want you to do is write down, why do you think the inspector is using such graphic imagery? It's not the most professional, so he must be doing it for a reason. Why do you think he's using this imagery here? That's what I want you to write down as one of your answers, please, the first question on the screen. Mr. Burling's response is rather impatiently, "Yes, yes, horrid business, but I don't understand why you should come here, Inspector." So Eric's response and Mr. Burling's response is very different to the inspector in this rather harrowing news. So the second question I want you to answer is, how do their reactions differ and what does this suggest about them? The father and son react very differently. What is the big difference and what does this tell us about their characters? Okay, and the last thing that I want you to do, based on what we've done today, is what are the audiences? Oh my goodness. I can only apologise for my lack of apostrophe. We'll blame it on the fact we're in lockdown. What are the audience's first impressions of Inspector Goole? So what I would like you to do is write one paragraph in response to this question here. Now, in your paragraph, it's going to be slightly different than the ones that we've been doing earlier on in the year because we're starting to include context in our answer. I'm going to show you how to do that on the next slide. But remember that for our Inspector Goule's exam, we are also assessed on context as well as our point evidence explain paragraphs. Okay, so when you write your paragraph, in response there needs to be a point. So what is the actual first impression? Where's the quote from the text? When you explain this quote, what does it suggest about the inspector? Is there something you can zoom in on? And also, is there any context to include? So this is how I want you to structure it. The inspector is referred to as. So this is where you can put one of those words from the stage direction or any other point you like from the stage direction. The use of the, what type of word is being used, gives the impression that his character is. That's your explanation. This could represent what about the inspector later on in the play. At the bottom, I've put some context there. You can literally use that context that I've put on the screen now in your own paragraph because we haven't learned enough about the inspector to link to all the context we've done so far. But I just want you to get in the habit of putting context in your answers. The structure I have on the screen is optional. You can use completely your own structure if you like, your own point evidence explain Zoom structure. But that's something on the board to help you if you need it. Okay, so there's a couple of questions to answer earlier on in the PowerPoint, and then the final task I want you to do is answer what are the audience's first impressions of Inspector Goole. Okay, hope it was helpful. Email me any questions, and when the work's done, email it through to me. Good luck, you will be fab.